Hi, and thanks for joining the Talking Animals Law and Philosophy series. My name is Raphael Fazel. I am the co-director of the Cambridge Centre for Animal Rights Law. If there's anyone joining here for the first time, I'm just going to say a few words about how the Talking Animal series works. After my short introduction, I will hand over to our speaker who will be, giving their presentation for around about 30 to 45 minutes. And we'll then move to a discussion part, a Q&A part of the talk where everyone's invited to come in with questions or comments. If you would like to say something in the discussion, please use the raise hand function that you can find under the reactions button just on the bottom of your Zoom app. And that will then allow me to go through your raised hands, and you can then ask your question directly or make your comment directly to our speaker, which is always nice, makes for good discussion. If you're in the train or you can't use, camera or microphone, feel free to type in your question into the chat, and I can then just read it out from there. Keep it short if you can, because it gets a bit boring if you have to listen to me too long reading out any sort of long text. Okay, and we're recording the presentation bit of this talk, but we'll turn off the recording in the discussion. Excellent. I think that's it as far as any of the housekeeping is concerned. And it is now my great pleasure to introduce our wonderful speaker for today, and that's Professor Rajesh Reddy. Raj directs the Animal Law program at the Center for Animal Law Studies in Lewis and Clark Law School, where he teaches animal law fundamentals, international animal law, animal legal philosophy, a paper that I would love to take, and he also teaches Emerging Topics in Animal Law, a course that is dedicated to the protection of insects, among others. Outside Lewis and Clark, Raj serves on the boards of World Animal Protection and the International Coalition for Animal Protection. And he also co-chairs the International Animal Law Subcommittee of the American Bar Association, if only there was an Animal Bar Association. Raj's talk today is entitled The Fly in the Ointment, the Problem and Promise of Insect Law and Ethics. Please join me in welcoming our speaker.
Okay, great. Are you able to see my screen?
Yes, we can.
So first, thank you, Raphael, and thank you to the Cambridge Center for Animal Rights Law for inviting me to give this talk as part of this series. It's both a pleasure and an honor, really, to be with all of you in the audience as well. And saying thank you for taking the time and really making the time to be here. I'm looking forward to engaging with you all during the Q&A session later. So with that said, and as Raphael mentioned, I'd like to begin by noting that I've had the pleasure of teaching, this past fall at Lewis and Clark, the world's first insect law course as part of our Emerging Topics in Animal Law series. And it's on that note that I'd like to reflect upon the word itself, emergence. As a lawyer and as an academic who works intimately with language that is negotiating, massaging, tangling with, and at times, even striving to subvert the plain meaning of words, I can't think of a more fitting topic for an Emerging Topics in Animal Law course than insects. Because when we think about what it means to emerge, the beings who come to mind, that is, who come to light, are insects who experience emergence, this birth and rebirth, multiple times over the course of their lives. With these recombinations having given rise over the millennia to the most diverse tapestry of life as we know it. Yet there is so very little that we actually do know about them, with a mere 900,000 of an estimated 30 million insect species having been documented to date, and with an estimated 10 quintillion, that is 10 million millions alive today. But therein lies the problem, I think. For insects are so small that we sometimes lack the capacity, and so numerous that we often lack just the inclination to appreciate their diversity, their individuality, and their value. So there are so many of them that, even when we can see them, they somehow go overlooked. And this is in comparison to their ostensibly more charismatic vertebrate and I think even invertebrate counterparts. Um, it was actually the conservationist Edward Wilson who called upon his peers to embrace a new perspective roughly a quarter century ago. And the vision he actually meant to impart was one of their emergence, if only we would pause to consider invertebrates generally and insects in particular. And what Wilson observed is that, if we were to unearth a clump of dirt in many parts of the world, that we would quite literally be holding the lives of thousands of invertebrates, some visible, many microscopic, others perhaps yet to be identified in the palms of our hands. And of the insects among them, he noted how they, together, proved the principal engineers of our world's life-sustaining ecosystems, capturing, for example, how in the forests of Central and South America, leafcutter ants industriously harvest forest vegetation to feed the fungi that they in turn consume. And in doing so, return those vital nutrients that the soil needs to keep that ecosystem, which serves as a carbon sink, alive. And though rarely seen, the influence of insects is all around us, from aerating the soil to pollinating fruits and flowers and crops, from breaking down organic matter to constituting the primary food source for so many other species up and along the trophic chain. And comparing them to what are often regarded as keystone species, Wilson argued that if we, human animals, were not so impressed by size alone, that we would find an ant more inspiring than a rhinoceros. And today, it's in light of the import of their voices that it's in light of their import that voices have begun to echo Wilson's call to protect these beings whom he referred to as the little things that run the world, a world that I, at least, have begun to think of fondly as the insectivorse. Yet it's through the use of insecticides, and not to mention herbicides, alongside air, soil, noise, water, and light pollution, the ravages of climate change, and our destruction of their habitat, that insects are running out of options, out of places to go and just be. And the numbers back this up. In a nearly 3-decade-long study of our anthropogenic effects, Germany found that its insect population had dropped by a staggering 75%, a statistic that they revised up to 82% when accounting for otherwise periods of peak activity. So to turn back to that clump of soil then, it's not so much that insects have been slipping through our fingers, so much as that we, humans, have been crushing them in hand. And so while the need to protect them has grown apparent in recent years, I think we would be hard pressed to argue that it's for their sake and not ours. And if I might draw upon this core tenet of chaos theory, the perhaps now tired cliche of the butterfly beating her wings in China, giving rise to a hurricane in the US, the real chaos we're learning is going to result from her failing to flap her wings at all. Indeed, our anthropocentric world doesn't just happen to overlap here and there with, but rather is coterminous with the insectivorse. And insects who've managed to survive all 5 mass extinction events to date, they don't need us in it. Rather, it's we humans who need them, the insects. So pivoting beyond conservation, I think what's also since emerged is that insects are not the hive-minded robots in miniature that scientists and society at large once believed them to be. Indeed, studies such as this one illustrate that juvenile bumblebees can engage in intrinsic play. Um, Studies have also shown that ants can appreciate themselves in mirrors, that And the implication of this, of course, being that they have a theory of the self, with this measure long having been thought to be the hallmark or the gold standard of cognition across species. Take two, this quite recent study attesting to the fact that bumblebees can appreciate the roles that their partners play in completing sort of novel tasks or tasks that demand cooperation. With this particular phenomenon, once thought to be exclusive to or in the ambit or precinct of big-brained mammals like elephants, like chimpanzees, like us. But ants and bees, they're not the only ones who garnered increased attention of late. And here I'd like to take some time to observe that numerous studies have been building towards this consensus that insects can and do feel pain, and not just this reflexive nociception-based response to, noxious or harmful stimuli, but also chronic neuropathic pain, alongside being able to experience stress and the physiological effects of depression. Um, the unfortunate subjects of one such study, a group of Drosophila, also known as common fruit flies, of whom you see one here, were subjected to light anesthesia basically every 48 hours, at which point they would wake to find a dozen dead conspecifics mixed in with the food in their glass vial cage. And perhaps unsurprisingly, these fruit flies, who were suddenly and repeatedly exposed to dozens of dead kin, expended more energy and were more likely, despite the presence of food, to starve to death, and quite literally aged 25% faster than their control group counterparts. And what's more, when some of the fruit flies who'd been exposed to these dead were put into vials with fruit flies who hadn't been exposed, that second group, the unexposed fruit flies, were also negatively affected, taking on some of the psychological markers of stress and anxiety as a result of sort of interacting with those who had been exposed. And the results of this study, according to its authors, more than just, the physiological changes that they documented, it appeared that these fruit flies had experienced, quote, emotion-like experiential states, as well as been able to, quote, infer the emotional states of others, with the authors of this report then acknowledging that it was, quote, plausible that the sight of dead conspecifics elucidates a depressive-like state that results in decreased longevity, that is to translate for us, premature death. We might ask, what purpose did our authors seek to carry this study out? It was basically to get some better insight into the physiological effects of death exposure in order to treat those among us, humans, who are routinely exposed to stressful situations. Think combat soldiers, first responders, and the like. And yet another study saw them subjected to repeated bouts of intense heat-induced pain from these, basically from these hot plates, in order to see if scientists could engender in them a sense of learned helplessness, that is a literal sort of giving up on life itself. And what helped bring these fruit flies out of these states, actually inclining them to actually start eating once again, were lithium treatments, the same prescribed for human patients who've been diagnosed with major depressive disorders. And these beings are exploited in quite literally untold numbers. And Drosophila in particular represent one of, if not the most used animal model globally. Scientific breakthroughs, primarily in the realm of genetics research, have exposed them to repeated bouts of radiation for the express purpose of, studying the inheritance of mutations, across and down generations. With these studies now having earned so-called, Drosophilus, I think 9, maybe even 10 Nobel Peace Prizes to date. And to quote one of the scientists, he said, "It's almost as if they were designed to help us." So, despite or perhaps due to the significance of their quote unquote contribution, Drosophila and so many other insects receive no real considerations under the federal and state laws of the US, and elsewhere, I think, that govern the welfare of animals used for research and testing purposes. As I noted earlier, both within and beyond the realm of research, what this growing body of literature is increasingly making clear is that insects, or at least many of them, can and do feel pain and thus possess sentience. Employing, actually the eight criteria used by the Birch meta-analysis from a couple of years ago in its review of, hundreds of studies on the ability of cephalopod mollusks and decapod crustaceans to feel pain, an analysis that ultimately led to legislators, there in the UK, including these taxa in the Animal Welfare Sentience Act of, I think it was 2022. This study by Gibbons et al. Interrogates much more limited data across 8 focal insect orders, with the upshot of the review really showing with a high level of confidence in many cases that adult insects in these orders are capable of feeling pain, with some orders demonstrating, shall we say, stronger indications of sentience than octopuses and lobsters. And I want to note too that for these gray boxes, for the very low indication of capacity for feeling pain, this really just means that, or in many cases, this means that, just studies into this particular criterion for that particular focal order simply just doesn't exist. And therefore, it shouldn't be taken as evidence of the non-existence or the inability for those focal orders to feel pain. And the picture here, as we see, grows far more complicated when considering the first through sort of the last sort of juvenile stages and star stages for most of these orders. To put it simply, sufficient data simply doesn't exist to suggest one way or the other that these juvenile insects can feel pain. But let me pause here to ask, if pain, for our juvenile bumblebee who, is clinging to her ball and what appears to be intrinsic play, is the appropriate or right, criterion for us to consider what we as animal advocates and the law might or perhaps morally should sort of owe them, given in particular that so many other animals, like so many other animals, insects are commodified for use as pets, for exhibition purposes, for fighting. They're also killed as this cochineal insect in the billions as dyes for food, not to mention for food itself, and predominantly as, or increasingly as feed for other farmed animals. With the UN Food and Agriculture Organization actually embracing insect-based agriculture as the sort of environmentally responsible answer to combating global food insecurity. And I would be remiss, I think, if I neglected to sort of give pause to really put a face to this sort of novel moral problem that insect-based agriculture poses, given its, size, its scale, and scope. And so here we have, kind of the protagonist of our story here, this black soldier fly, who as an adult can lay anywhere between 200 and 600 eggs a day. And as they progress through each instar stage, the larvae will eat, well, they'll practically eat anything. And so are fed on industrial agriculture outputs. Think, the inedible parts of corn production, blood meal, offal. And these are all basically reintegrated as side streams or upcycle, as the industry boasts, with our larvae in just a couple of weeks, growing up to 50 times their initial body weight. And it's in this sort of last instar stage, before he undergoes this metamorphosis, that he and his brothers and his sisters will have, quote unquote, been harvested, meaning that they will have been frozen, microwaved, shredded, or starved to death in order to be turned into animal feed for industrially farmed chickens, pigs, and increasingly, given that we are depleting our oceans, fishes, and as food for our pets. To put, the scale of this enterprise into context for us, just one of these facilities is capable of producing, not just tens, but hundreds of thousands of tons of insect feed each year, And with several of these facilities, in construction right now, including the largest such facility slated to be completed here in the US next year, the scale is gigantic. We're talking about more than 1 trillion animals annually, and a number that, will eventually eclipse the total number of all other animals, of course, subjected to factory farming in our world. And beyond, the black soldier fly, and 3 or 4 other sort of species commodified by the industry for animal feed, the FAO is, actively promoting entomophagy, or the direct practice, the human practice of insect consumption. And the industry itself has identified, the humble cricket as its quote unquote, gateway bug, behind which there are some, 2,000 other insect species, a veritable, smorgasbord of delectables, with each, bearing a unique flavor and texture profile. And the industry is, already marketing these products to, let's just call them, the gastro-curious, the environmentally conscious, the nutritionally focused, the protein-minded consumer. So again, a significant use of these animals who have, long rested at the margins of our consideration. And I would be remiss too if I did not mention, their use for clothing, with silkworms in particular, boiled in this, this quiescent pupal state, preventing, those here on the left from emerging as or realizing the potential of their adult imago form here on the right. So it's against this backdrop that I'd like to just touch upon a few conservation and welfare frameworks to illustrate how insects fit, or more often than not, fail to fit into the law, as well as, make an argument and stress why animal advocates, I think, must embrace a holistic approach to better secure their protections. And in doing so, as I noted at the outset, I hope to attest to how, for those of us who are working in the law, words so often, fail us, confound us, and, indeed at times can even manage to surprise. So take, for example, the U.S. Endangered Species Act, or ESA, this federal law that protects all classes of endangered animals, including arthropods, so a category that insects like the spotted lanternfly fall into. Yet in the very next breath, the ESA singles out insects alone among them for potential listing as quote unquote pests, who are then afforded no protections if deemed a threat to humans. And we see this general animus against insects in other contexts as well, such as when they're classified as non-native or invasive species. Take, for example, the U.S. Department of Agriculture's, campaign targeting each and every single life stage of our spotted lanternfly, with numerous news outlets, capturing the thrust of this need to kill them with this catchy phrase: "See it, squish it." So bringing this, a little bit closer to home for a moment, if I might, all the more curious, even confounding, is New York's conservation law, which features, 2 main elements that I'd like to touch upon. The first states that New York owns all of the animals in its jurisdiction, with a notable qualification for insects alone, who may be the property of the state, but if and only if they are listed as protected. And we might pause here to just ask, why this stipulation about property and about ownership? What purpose could it possibly serve? Well, as our second element betrays, the logic of the state's ability, or, even authority to regulate and indeed prevent the killing, the taking, the possession of animals lies in its pre-existing ownership of them. And so what's ironic then is that it's actually unprotected insects alone among all other forms of animal life who escape being classified as legal property, the status that advocates like myself and many of you are striving to lift them out of. And yet, being something other than the inherent property of the state would leave them, by the letter of this law, outside of the law's protections. Shifting, if I may, to the welfare arena, insects are excluded through a myriad of mechanisms, such as in our Federal Animal Welfare Act, and not by virtue of their taxonomic class, but due to their inability to regulate their internal temperature, for being, in a word, exotherms. So compare this to state anti-cruelty frameworks, such as New Mexico's, which excludes them explicitly. In my home state of Oregon, by contrast, the exclusion is implicit. Insects simply aren't named, but do take the protections for fishes, or do take note of the protection for fishes, however, which I'll touch upon in a moment. But for now, let me say that other states' laws present even more complex and intriguing sort of puzzles. For example, Minnesota defines animals using these all-inclusive terms, yet it's questionable whether a court would actually deem insects to be animals for the purpose of enjoying those protections that basically all other animals receive, allowing, of course, for, use specific exemptions. Yet Minnesota also features use-specific protections, such as for animals possessed for one's enjoyment as pets or companions, and who merit, in light of this unique relationship that fundamentally focuses on our sentiments, added protections with regard to certain harms. And so perhaps a court would find, that my, pet beetle or this Atlas moth should qualify if he were to come into my home, see him, and squish him. Perhaps, but owing again to their emergence and reemergence, we might also wonder, since our Atlas moth is the same subject of a life here as here, if our court would find that he should be protected from my future or even present enjoyment while in his larval state. But then I ask, what about the pupal state in between? Perhaps, or perhaps not. And of course, what animal advocates like myself must ask is, whether elevating, the status of insects in the law's eyes is worth it if it encourages their captivity. And the answers, to these questions have stark implications for other forms of animal life as well. If I may, bridge the pond, so to speak, between us, given the center's topic for this year's, essay competition, take the Non-Human Rights Project's habeas corpus case to free an elephant, this elephant named Happy from the Bronx Zoo, based on the argument that she merits certain liberty rights, given her status as a self-aware, cognitively complex creature. And how do we know that? Well, as observed by the Non-Human Rights Project itself, Happy was a first elephant to pass the merit test back in 2005. And although the court's majority determined that she didn't merit the granting of habeas, two judges dissented to express views to the contrary. And as to their framing of the majority's argument, that to do so would open, those proverbial floodgates, such as to require a child with an ant farm to defend the confinement, the captivity of each and every one of those insects, they said, ants simply can't make the same claims that Happy can. And, while it's certainly, true that we know more about elephants, I think the fact that ants have passed the mirror self-recognition test, among others, more than suggests that, they have similar and arguably equal claims to liberty, which the right of habeas corpus, at its core is designed to affirm and protect. And, what I wonder, just personally, is if what this really comes down to in the end is, the charismatic character of a species, which is, as Wilson reminds us, a feature that's in the eye of the beholder. And what I've come to fear is that insects, have always been and are increasingly becoming the foils of even, progressive court opinions. And yet to include them would, if we're speaking in practical terms, lead to legislative backlash at this point in time. And so, I wonder, if not now for insects, when? And if there will be a when, how will that arrive? And how do we, and do we, help realize that day? And these are just, a few of the overarching questions that, my students and I have had the opportunity to interrogate here at Lewis and Clark. And the answer, I believe, is beginning to take shape in some conservation circles, with a notable case having arisen earlier this year in California, where the legislature provided that certain animals were to be protected, even at great cost. And regulating these protections fell to the Fish and Game Commission, which defined fish, interestingly, to include a number of species that were not fishes. And it was against this backdrop that advocates, started calling for the listing of bumblebees, who are at historic risk there, but are not, of course, fishes in the plain or the scientific meaning of the word. And such was the counter argument advanced by the almond industry, which would have certainly harmed them as part of their production practices. And indeed, they said the commission had just overstepped its authority by listing them. And I think, outside the context of this case, many of us would agree with that sentiment. There's just something, shall we say, fishy about calling insects fishes. But the court sided with the state, holding that the term fish does include them. You know, and I'll pause here to, share my belief that this case wasn't really about what a word means, but of the need to stretch and to craft new meaning from the words that we have, whether that's in light of the insect crisis, its ecological consequences, the economic value of, so-called pollinator species, of which bees and bumblebees are indeed sort of the poster insects of, or perhaps, just perhaps owing to some of these studies attesting to their cognitive, to their social, and other capacities. In its pure sense, what I think the court was calling for was a need to provide for their reemergence, to help them recover from the harms that we have caused. But what of other realms, uses, and forms of exploitation? What I think this case affords us is some insight into how, even if the letter of the law can't be rewritten yet, whether in your jurisdiction or mine, the meaning of the law can evolve, and that it's incumbent upon us to see that evolution through, so that perhaps one day in my home state of Oregon, an insect might be regarded as a fish to be equitably protected against acts of cruelty. Or perhaps in a habeas corpus case some years down the line, an ant, already more inspiring than a rhinoceros, might in turn also be seen as an elephant. That is, until she no longer needs to be. With my own hope being that, one day in the not too distant future, we might begin to really see and appreciate them for, what and who they are. And here, I'd like to suggest that that future has already begun to emerge, with Germany, as of, a year or so ago, having passed the world's first national insect protection law. And what it provides for, among, these insecticide and herbicide bans, are requirements for educational campaigns at all levels of society, as well as the regulation of light pollution, so as to lead us into what I offer, what I believe are brighter days ahead, if only we would dim our lights a little so that theirs can burn more brightly, if not as, re-emergent guiding lights for us. And it's on that note, that I'd like to return to touch upon the title of my talk. And in particular, what I'd like to observe in closing is, how one of the enduring measures of human kindness, at least here in the United States, has long since been whether we, as individuals, would or wouldn't hurt a fly. But the reason that this test, one that asks us to take this hard look in the mirror, has withstood the test of time, I think, is that it's historically subverted itself at the outset, owing to the skepticism as to whether flies can even feel pain and thus be harmed. Yet the growing evidence to the contrary presents a unique opportunity to challenge society to reassess its moral underpinnings with regard to creatures, both great and small. And while, I'll be the first to acknowledge that it's unlikely insects will ever realize the same visibility enjoyed by other species, what is clear is that it's no longer the case that they should be seen as, flies in the proverbial ointment, at least insofar as that metaphor has long been understood. Rather, if our advocacy on behalf of animals is to have the balming effect that we seek, I think it's imperative that we realize that it's the fly, and by extension, other insects who represent part of the cure. Thank you.